define a good life? Maybe it's the number of hours you spend engaged in meaningful tasks every day. Maybe it's your general level of happiness. Maybe it's just knowing that you're able to meet your fundamental needs, which everyone knows are food, shelter, and Disney Plus. We define well-being in different ways, depending on what we want out of life. Did you know that nations also have their own terms for well-being? They use them to describe population-level well-being, so that they can track things like how healthy their citizens are and what can be changed. Today we're going to be talking about the WELLBY Approach, which is a technique that some researchers use to measure well-being in different nations. So what exactly is WELLBY, and why is the WELLBY Approach important? The premise behind the WELLBY Approach is that in order to accurately evaluate individuals' well-being, we need to look at not just how much well-being they experience in their lives, but we also need to look at how long they're living. After all, in many cases, lifespan, or the length of life, is an indicator of how healthy people were when they were living. So researchers wanted to create a unit of measurement for assessing well-being that combined quality of life and length of life into a single measure. After a lot of brainstorming and number crunching, they came up with the WELLBY Approach, which stands for Well-Being Year. Well-Being Year, or WELLBY, refers to the amount of well-being that an individual experiences over the course of 1 year of their life. Researchers sum up, or they add up, all of the well-beings that an individual is expected to experience over all of the years that they live for, or rather all of the years that they are expected to live for. Since the future is so uncertain, as those of us who have gone through the transition from 2019 to 2020 sure know, researchers can't actually measure how much well-being a person will experience each year for the rest of their lives. So to account for the fact that the amount of well-being experienced per year becomes increasingly uncertain as researchers move further into the future, they include an element or variable called a pure discount rate, which is represented by the symbol delta in their equation. I won't get into what this element means, but you can learn more about it by reading a more in-depth article about the WELLBY Approach, and I've linked that in my description. Researchers can't predict how long people will live, so they have to estimate how long they'll live by looking at how long people today live. Well-being is measured on a scale of 0 to 10, and the assumption here is that a score of 0 would apply to people who are no longer living, and 10 is essentially the best possible outcome. The WELLBY is a unique measure of well-being because it takes many different types of well-being into account. There are some measures that only take physical health or mental health into account, but as we've learned throughout this series, well-being can take the form of mental health, social health, emotional health, and more. So the WELLBY Approach considers these types of well-being, which makes it a helpful companion for policymakers who want to create policies that promote well-being. But before discussing well-being trends around the world, let's take a look at trends in well-being and life expectancy, which are the two crucial ingredients that make up a WELLBY score. On a broad level, researchers found that countries that ranked in the top 11 for well-being were also the countries that ranked in the top 11 for WELLBY scores. And this is because, as it turns out, a country's well-being scores are highly correlated. Remember, that just means that two things are related with a country's WELLBY scores. Finland was at the top, Canada was ranked 10th, and Austria was number 11. Researchers also found that although global well-being has stayed the same since 2008, life expectancy around the world increased by almost 4 years, up until 2019. This increase was driven by increases in life expectancy that individual countries experienced. So for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, life expectancy increased by 7 years. This increase contributed to the 4-year increase that we experienced between 2008 and 2019. Despite the increase in life expectancy observed until 2019, life expectancy decreased in 2020 due to pandemic deaths. This decrease was particularly visible in places with high death rates like the USA and the UK. However, these decreases weren't enough to actually eliminate all of the gains that had been made since 2008 up until 2019. With those trends in mind, let's look at each nation's well-being performance during COVID. So to evaluate each country's ranking, the researchers looked at the way that COVID impacted each country's well-being through its effect on income, unemployment, and life expectancy. And then they ranked countries according to the extent to which their levels of well-being suffered the most, starting with those countries that had the greatest suffering and moving down. Based on this ranking, the top 10 countries that suffered the most included Peru, South America, Colombia, Dominican Republic, and Spain in the number 10 spot. The USA was ranked number 12, the UK was ranked number 20, and Canada was ranked number 35. Across these results, the researchers also found that there was a strong correlation between losses of life and GDP losses. And this simply meant that countries that controlled the disease better, and so who therefore controlled the number of people who died from the disease, were able to avoid GDP losses. So what exactly can be done with this data? Well, researchers suggest that policymakers should look at all of this data and that they should really dig deep into examining what the WELLBY approach is, and that they should strive to make decisions that will generate the greatest possible number of WELLBYs per person. So specifically, the author suggests that policies should be evaluated to assess the number of WELLBYs that they are estimated to produce. And remember that WELLBY refers to the amount of well-being experienced in 1 year of life for a person. So this might involve looking at the number of WELLBYs produced per dollar spent on implementing a policy, and ideally this will ensure that policies have the greatest impact on all types of well-being, and that those policies that don't have a strong positive impact on well-being won't be implemented. So we've come to the end of our Brain Bloom series. Thanks so much for hanging in there. If I've done my job, you have learned about what a WELLBY is and how it's measured, how different nations are performing based on well-being levels and life expectancy during the pandemic, which nations are most and least negatively impacted by pandemic-related factors based on the WELLBY approach, and how policymakers can use WELLBY data to make decisions that promote well-being. This episode was created for the Psych 430 course at the University of Toronto, St. George campus. This video was produced and filmed by Joseanne Buchanan with the help of several great resources listed in the description section, and the curriculum was developed by Joseanne Buchanan based on the wonderful information provided in the World Happiness Report.